Imagine a world without the Bible. Difficult, right? Now, think about how a collection of texts written thousands of years ago transformed into the most influential book in history. The journey is fascinating, full of mysteries and twists. What if I told you that this transformation was far from simple? Let's explore how these ancient texts, spread across various cultures and eras, were carefully compiled. Who decided what would be included? What criteria were used? Back in ancient times, what we now call the Bible was a collection of scrolls and papyri, written in different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But how did these sacred words take the form of a book? And why were some stories included while others were left out? The process was long and meticulous, passing through the hands of kings, prophets, and scholars. But who were these people and what were their motivations? What challenges did they face? And most intriguingly, how did these texts survive persecution and time? Hold that curiosity and get ready to dive into a story of faith, power, and perseverance. Every detail of this journey reveals something surprising. Let's unravel this enigma together. Origin and oral tradition. Imagine a time before writing, a period when stories, teachings, and traditions were passed down from generation to generation through spoken word. It is in this context that the biblical accounts began to form. People gathered around campfires, within families or communities, and told stories about the deeds of God, the patriarchs, the prophets, and important events from their past. These narratives were carefully memorized and transmitted with great precision, as they held immense spiritual and cultural value. Oral tradition was not just a way to tell stories, but a means to keep the identity and faith of a people alive. Religious leaders, such as priests and elders, played a crucial role in this process, as they were the guardians of these narratives. They ensured that the details were not lost and that the content was faithfully passed on to new generations. This was especially important in a time when writing was not widely accessible and literacy was limited to a few people. Furthermore, oral tradition allowed for a certain flexibility and adaptation of stories to the circumstances and needs of the community. This does not mean that the essence of the narratives changed, but small details could be adjusted to make the message more relevant to the current audience. This dynamic process helped keep the stories alive and meaningful over time. As centuries passed, the need to fix these stories in written form became evident. Oral tradition, though effective, had its limitations, especially in times of crisis or dispersion of the people. Writing emerged as a solution to more permanently preserve these sacred accounts. Thus, the transition from oral tradition to writing was a significant milestone in the history of biblical scriptures. Therefore, the origin of the biblical accounts is deeply rooted in the practice of oral tradition. It was through this practice that stories and teachings reached us, crossing generations and challenges. Oral tradition was the first step in the long journey of the Bible, a fundamental step that laid the groundwork for what was to come in the history of the writing of sacred texts. Writing of the original texts. The transition from oral tradition to the writing of biblical texts was a gradual and complex process, influenced by various historical and cultural factors. The earliest texts began to be written in a context where writing was becoming an indispensable tool for administration and preservation of knowledge. Scribes, highly trained individuals, were responsible for this monumental task, recording the words on materials such as parchment, papyrus, and eventually paper. The original texts of the Bible were written in three main languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Hebrew was the predominant language for most of the Old Testament texts, while Aramaic, a Semitic language close to Hebrew, was used in some parts, especially in books like Daniel and Ezra. The New Testament, in turn, was written in Koine Greek, a common form of Greek used in the Hellenistic world after the conquests of Alexander the Great. The authors of these texts were varied figures, ranging from prophets and kings to apostles and evangelists. Each wrote under different circumstances and motivations, but all shared a common goal: to record God's word to instruct, inspire, and guide the people. For example, Moses is traditionally considered the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch, while apostles like Paul wrote letters to the early Christian communities. The historical context in which these texts were written also played a crucial role in their composition. During periods of peace and prosperity, the texts tended to reflect a celebration of the covenant between God and his people. In times of crisis, exile, or oppression, the texts often took on a more prophetic tone and called for repentance. These writings not only documented the history and faith of the people, but also offered comfort and hope in difficult times. Therefore, the writing of the original text of the Bible was a task full of challenges and deep significance. Every word, every sentence, and every book was carefully composed to convey spiritual and historical truths. This initial phase of writing was crucial for the preservation of oral traditions and for the formation of the biblical canon, the process of selection and recognition that would be the next step in the history of sacred scriptures. Canonization. The process of canonization, which is the selection and recognition of sacred books, did not happen overnight. It was a long path of debates and decisions that unfolded over several centuries. In the case of the Old Testament, different Jewish communities had their own collections of sacred texts. It was only around the 1st century AD that there was a clearer consensus among Jews about which books should be considered canonical. These books were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and their stories and teachings formed the basis of Jewish faith and practice. In Christianity, the story was a bit different. The first Christians, who were mostly Jews, initially used what we now call the Old Testament. However, as the Christian movement grew and spread, new writings began to emerge that recounted the life and teachings of Jesus and the apostles. These new texts circulated among Christian communities and were read in meetings and worship services, but there was no consensus on which of them should be considered sacred. The New Testament began to take shape from the 2nd century, when ecclesiastical leaders began to cite and use certain texts more consistently. However, it was not until the late 4th century that the Western Christian Church, in synods such as those of Hippo, 393 AD, and Carthage, 397 AD, reached a consensus on the 27 books that would form the New Testament. This decision was based on criteria such as apostolicity, orthodoxy, and liturgical use. It is interesting to note that the process of canonization was not without controversies. Some books now considered apocryphal, such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Shepherd of Hermas, were quite popular in certain Christian communities. But for different reasons, they were not included in the official canon. Canonization, therefore, reflects a series of theological and practical judgments that shape the Bible as we know it today. This complex process of canonization ensured that the Bible became a unified and authoritative text for faith communities. However, the diversity of traditions and writings that were debated and sometimes excluded also shows the richness and complexity of the religious traditions that contributed to the formation of sacred scriptures. Ancient translations. The ancient translations of the Bible played a crucial role in the dissemination of the biblical text and in the formation of religious traditions. One of the most important was the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, around the 3rd century BC. This work was commissioned to serve the large Greek-speaking Jewish community and ended up significantly influencing early Christianity. The Septuagint was not just a translation, but also an interpretation, offering nuances and understandings that sometimes differed from the original Hebrew text. Many early Christians, including the authors of the New Testament, frequently cited the Septuagint, which helped integrate it into the Christian tradition. It was also fundamental to the dissemination of Judaism and Christianity in the Greek diaspora, serving as a bridge between Jewish and Hellenistic cultures. Another ancient translation of great importance is the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible made by Saint Jerome in the late 4th century AD. Jerome was commissioned by Pope Damasus I to revise the old Latin translations of the Bible, which were often inconsistent. He decided to translate directly from Hebrew and Greek to ensure greater accuracy. The Vulgate became the official version of the Bible in the Roman Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. The Vulgate had a profound impact on theology, liturgy, and Christian art in medieval Europe. Its widespread use helped standardize liturgy and doctrine across the continent, and its translations influenced countless literary and artistic works. Additionally, being written in Latin, the scholarly language of the time, the Vulgate helped preserve the cultural and religious unity of Western Europe during the Middle Ages. These ancient translations not only made the Bible accessible to a broader audience, but also shaped the way the scriptures were interpreted and understood. The Septuagint and the Vulgate are testaments to the ongoing efforts of translators and scholars to preserve and transmit sacred texts, ensuring that they continued to inspire and guide faith communities throughout the centuries. Manuscripts and codices. Ancient manuscripts and codices are invaluable treasures in the preservation and transmission of biblical texts. Among them, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus are two of the most important. The Codex Sinaiticus, dated to the 4th century, is one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Bible in Greek. It was discovered at the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai and includes much of the Old and New Testaments. The Codex Vaticanus, also from the 4th century, is equally significant. It is preserved in the Vatican Library and contains nearly the entire Bible in Greek, although some books are missing. These codices are fundamental for scholars because they provide a very ancient and relatively complete witness to the biblical texts, allowing comparisons with other manuscripts and helping to identify textual variants. In addition to these codices, there are thousands of smaller manuscripts and fragments that have been found over the years. Each of these manuscripts has its own particularities and variations, making the work of textual critics quite complex. They compare different manuscripts to try to reconstruct the most original text possible, considering that most of the oldest manuscripts were copied and recopied many times, often by hand. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 was another major milestone. These texts, dating from around 200 BC to 70 AD, include some of the oldest known copies of Old Testament books. They were found in caves near Qumran, by the Dead Sea, and provided scholars with a valuable reference point for understanding the evolution of the biblical text over the centuries. Ancient manuscripts and codices are thus key pieces in the history of the Bible. They not only help us understand how the text was preserved and transmitted, but also offer a glimpse into the religious and cultural practices of the communities that produced them. Each manuscript is a living testimony to the faith and dedication of those who strove to keep the sacred scriptures alive and accessible for future generations. Gutenberg's printing press. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century was a watershed moment in human history, especially regarding the dissemination of knowledge. Before the press, Bibles were copied by hand by monks in monasteries, a time-consuming and error-prone process. Gutenberg's press changed this radically. For the first time, it was possible to produce multiple copies of a book quickly and accurately, and the Bible was one of the first books to be printed. The Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible, was printed around 1455 and is considered a masterpiece of typography. With the ability to print on a large scale, the Bible became more accessible to the general public, no longer restricted to elites and clergy. This had a profound impact on the spread of Christian faith and literacy, as more people had access to the sacred text and, consequently, to reading. Gutenberg's press not only facilitated the distribution of the Bible, but also sparked a cultural and intellectual revolution. The availability of printed texts allowed the spread of ideas, fostered the Renaissance, and eventually the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, for example, used the press to distribute his 95 Theses and other works that questioned the Catholic Church, amplifying his message in a way that would have been impossible without printing technology. Additionally, printing the Bible in vernacular languages made the sacred text accessible to people who did not understand Latin. Before Gutenberg, the Latin Vulgate was the most widely used version of the Bible. With the press, translations into German, English, French, and other languages began to proliferate, allowing the faithful to read and interpret the scriptures for themselves, without the mediation of the clergy. This democratized religious knowledge and had profound social and cultural implications. Finally, Gutenberg's press also led to the development of new book illustration and design techniques, which further enriched the Bible reading experience. Printed editions began to include illustrations, maps, and other resources that helped contextualize and explain the text. This advancement made the Bible not only a religious text, but also a cultural and artistic object. In short, Gutenberg's press was an innovation that transformed how the Bible and other texts were produced and consumed, with lasting effects on culture and society. Modern versions. The development of modern versions of the Bible is a continuous and dynamic process that seeks to balance textual accuracy with accessibility for contemporary readers. Since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, scholars have had access to biblical texts dating back to as early as the 2nd century BC, allowing for more precise revisions of existing translations. These archaeological discoveries have been crucial in correcting errors and clarifying obscure passages, providing a more faithful understanding of the original text. In addition to archaeological discoveries, advances in linguistics also play a crucial role in modernizing Bible versions. Comparative studies in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, the original languages of the Bible, allow for more precise translation. Modern translators employ an interdisciplinary approach, consulting experts in history, culture, and language to ensure that the translation is as faithful as possible to the original text while being understandable to today's reader. The quest for greater precision and clarity in Bible translation also involves an ongoing effort to make the text more inclusive and accessible. Modern translators frequently revise passages that may be seen as archaic or difficult to understand, replacing outdated terms with contemporary language. This does not mean altering the text's meaning, but rather ensuring it is comprehensible and relevant to modern audiences. This process is delicate and requires balancing fidelity to the original text with intelligibility for the current reader. Modern versions of the Bible also vary according to religious denomination and intended use. For example, the New International Version, NIV, is widely used by Protestants and evangelicals for its clarity and accessibility, while the New Vulgate is the official version of the Roman Catholic Church. There are also translations specific to different cultures and contexts, such as the Bible in Sign Language for the deaf or the contextualized Bible for indigenous communities. These variations reflect the diversity of Christianity and the need to adapt the biblical message to different audiences. Finally, modern technology has further expanded access to the Bible. Reading apps, audio versions, and digital platforms allow people to read or listen to the Bible virtually anywhere and anytime. This not only facilitates access to the sacred text, but also allows more people to engage with it in ways that were previously unimaginable. The combination of archaeological, linguistic, and technological advances ensures that the Bible's message remains relevant and accessible, regardless of time and space barriers. Conclusion. Now that we understand how the Bible became the most influential book in history, let's reflect on its impact on our lives. Have you ever wondered what the world would be like without the Bible? How would our understanding of values and morality be different? Imagine living in a society where Jesus' message of love, forgiveness, and justice had not been disseminated. What would be our references? And moreover, how do these teachings still shape the culture and behavior of modern societies? Another intriguing question: what other ancient texts might have changed the course of history if they had been preserved and disseminated in the same way as the Bible? And if you could travel back in time and witness the compilation of these sacred texts, what would you ask the scribes and translators? Finally, think about the diversity of Bible translations and interpretations. How do these different versions affect our understanding of the original text? Stay tuned, because in the next video we will explore fascinating stories of biblical peoples and how their lives reflect lessons we can still learn today. Leave your questions and reflections on the Bible's impact on your life in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing content. See you next time.